Okay, so now without further delay, I'm very happy to call upon the Prime Minister to start.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to talk about two broad things in this debate. Why we think the current system of democracy is flawed, and why we think our policy is morally permissible and leads to better outcomes for more vulnerable groups of people in society. And secondly, what are these outcomes that are created by this policy and how it changes the political landscape, both in the way individuals interact with policies as well as with the way political parties often establish their campaigns and the way they go about elections. So a model before I start, it's going to be very clear, presumably there's a technology which gives individuals an empathy score, which can reasonably accurately determine how empathetic they are to, importantly, people who are outside their circles. By circles, we mean things like outside their race, their religion, their neighborhood, their sexual orientation, and any other kind of division that you can think of. We can have this kind of test a few months before the election, and obviously this is not going to be a permanent score. We can keep retesting these people for all different kinds of elections. If you think your empathy score has changed due to the experiences in your life or the way that you conduct yourself, you think you can retake this test at any time and get and be allowed to vote. Yes. Yes, perhaps. Yeah, why not? Yeah, that could be one of the things. Maybe we could have a broad empathy score, presumably, which includes other living beings as well. Firstly, why is this principally fair? Because we would argue the reason we believe in democracy or one vote per one person is not because of any principal reason, but rather to say that it is the least objectionable form of government. What it does is it ignores the selfish, tribalistic traits and the entrenched monopolies that certain communities have when you have a system like democracy. We will argue, we will posit a small thought experiment. If you lived in a world in which someone else could make all decisions for you, where you had no control over them, but you knew that everyone would be better off, and the most vulnerable people in the society would probably have a much better standard of living, would you allow that? And we think that's something that we think is something that we would live by, which we feel makes our policy principally permissible. Because what happens in status quo as a result of democracy and one vote per one person, the question is, how do people vote to begin with? We think, firstly, people often think about either themselves or those around them. What does this look like? It looks like caring for people who are arbitrarily belonging to your family, people who belong to your race or the neighborhood that you were born into, people who belong to the religion that you were arbitrarily born into because your parents believe in that religion, or people who belong to the same economic class that you happen to grow up into. What does that mean? It means that in most countries in which there are large, often majorities, or when people sharing certain characteristics have much larger numbers, they tend to often vote in ways which entrench the power that they have over things like government policy. Meaning, like white people, for example, because they're a statistical majority in the US, are far more likely to care about, even if they're not empathetic, things that affect other white people. Things like the fact, like people within their own circle, other people who are white, or people, even if they aren't empathetic, often coincidentally share the same kind of values or the same kind of circumstances as they do. The fact that just because you're black is far more likely you share a similar rate of economic success in society, barring a few exceptions, meaning that even if you're not an empathetic black person, it's more likely that you share similar common characteristics, means that you're far more likely to entrench the power of majorities in these things. Open.
Yeah, so why not just limit the vote then to very intelligent, empathetic people? Why is that all empathetic?
Because we don't think voting should just be based on your intelligence. It should be based on like what you feel about the way policy affects you. Or often there are things which are non-objective about policy, but that doesn't mean, but we think largely including empathetic people broadly improves policies much better as compared to including the larger group of populations. what is the impact of this policy in terms of the outcomes that it creates? There are a few things. Firstly, we think vulnerable groups benefit the most, irrespective of their birth lottery. Like, by definition, people who are empathetic are far more likely to care about people who are unlike them. It is often, empathy often is a natural trait, but it often is one that is acquired by engaging life experiences which are beyond those of your own. It is far more likely that these people are going to vote into policy which improves the lives of the people who aren't exactly around them. The beneficiaries of these policies are likely to be the most vulnerable groups who need this help to begin with. The fact that even if we admit that like privileged communities like large amounts of white people might lose their ability to vote, these are people who least require government assistance to begin with. And that's something that we are willing to trade off, meaning that if your natural consequences at birth are far better than the other people, we're okay to trade that off to include more empathetic people who benefit larger number of people. But secondly, what does it do to poor people? Because that seems like, on the face of it, the one broad community of people which might seem like our policy excludes, because the vote is often the only thing that they have. A few things to say to this. Firstly, poor people are far more likely to be empathetic. Why do we say this? Most studies and surveys show that middle and poor Americans donate a much larger percentage of their income to charity than rich people do. That is indicative of the fact that poor people are far more likely to engage in activities which demonstrate empathy and are more likely to be selected via this test to allow them to vote, meaning that a larger number of poor people get the ability or retain the ability to vote and improve their lives and do not lose their ability to try and improve their lives through democracy. But secondly, even if some poor people are excluded, we get far more number of more privileged people who care about them to vote. So meaning that they probably end up with the same or better outcome for themselves when you exclude the large group of privileged people who do not care for them, who aren't able to vote. But secondly, what does it do to political parties, Mr. Speaker? And this is extremely important in the developing world when rates of education penetration are low. The political parties often depend on things like appealing to the tribalistic notions of people, often campaigning on things like race or religion, often leading to things like racial riots in many parts of Asia, leading to massive racial tensions which then erupt into violence, or things like segregation of different classes of people, because certain political parties prefer through policy, like try and have affirmative action for majorities, for example, or the rejection of refugees at the border is often because political parties try to pander to people on things like nationalistic or tribalistic traits. Our policy creates a far more equitable electorate in which political parties are forced to like pitch policies which are equitable, which most people are benefited. In a world in which only empathetic people can vote, political parties can no longer depend on things like tribalism, on things like race and religion to forward their cause or appealing to the most visceral emotions of individuals, but have to put forward policy which is beneficial for all individuals. We think that improves policy generally and improves the way in which campaigning and the focus it then moves to policy rather than on religious rhetoric. We think that's a benefit for the electoral system that we want to accept. But lastly, most importantly, we think it incentivizes people to be more empathetic, right? In a world in which your ability to vote or your ability to control your future and that of your family, something that is presumably driven by a selfish interest, is dependent on your ability to be empathetic, we think people are far more likely to engage in things like experiences outside their life or develop a sort of empathy which cares about other people apart from themselves. We think even if it leads to no policy outcomes, it creates a far more humane and accepting society in which people are generally more empathetic and care about others in real day-to-day life and aren't discriminatory to begin with. We think our policy improves the political system, and even if it doesn't, it creates a far more humane and more accepting society we're extremely proud to propose.
We agree that empathy allows you to represent the needs of others, but I think it's far better if people got to speak for themselves. And that's why we stand for one man, one vote democracy, where individuals, even if they're minorities, are allowed still to vote and debate on their own interests. We're going to forward two broad lines of argument. First of all, their policy leads to bad outcomes and greater inequity. Second of all, that it harms political decision-making as well as the whole process of political discourse. But before that, I just want to point out that the entire case coming from opening government assumes a consequentialist outcome. It assumes that A, inclusive policies are necessarily objectively better, and B, empathetic people are more likely to vote for these objectively better policies. They haven't proven both of these assumptions, especially B. It is not clear why empathetic individuals are more likely always and in all circumstances to vote for the policies that are more inclusive, especially for underprivileged groups. Let's give an illustration. For example, accepting all economic migrants may be a policy that appeals to the empathetic, and they might be inclined to accept more of these people because on the whole it makes their lives a lot better, and that they might come to know them individually and therefore feel a greater sense of empathy for them. But it may not be correct due to issues like, for example, brain drain in the developing world. So it's not clear that the trade-off automatically falls in the vast majority of these cases in favor of a policy that appeals to the empathetic. This leads me on very nicely to my first argument, actually, about inequitable and objectively bad outcomes. The rest of the rebuttal, I think, can be integrated. So, we think that empathy means that, yes, you are better able to sympathize and feel the suffering of another human being that you are less connected to. It does not mean, however, that you are free from things like vengefulness, prejudice, or any other of blinkers that cloud decision-making. In particular, a lack of ability to rationally weigh up the costs and benefits. The clear comparative in this debate is that everyone represents and votes for their own interests on our side. We agree that in many cases this allows majorities to run roughshod over minority groups, and this is a fundamental issue with democracy in these cases. But we rather minorities be able to remain to vote in their own interest, because we think that this makes the situation far better for them in terms of their ability to campaign and bargain. I'm going to talk about this right now. So what are the harms coming from team government? First of all, it is not clear that we get policy making that is just objectively in a consequential manner better. Empathetic policy making favors a particular strand of policy making that results in short-term gratification and less graphic consequences. For example, people on their side are probably less likely to adopt economic policies like breaking up unions that might result in long-term benefit for a very graphic short-run cost. It is not clear that we should decide policy making based on the graphicness of their policies and their ability to appeal to individuals' sense of empathy, just because they might happen to know more disadvantaged workers, for example, which will lead them to disfavor that kind of policy. So it's not clear that graphic imagery is the best way to decide government policy. Secondly, we think that empathy is actually often a function of privilege. So Mitra said that often the rich people are those with the least empathy. We don't really see a reason for this, right? And he didn't provide a systemic analysis for this, other than the fact that the poor people donate a slightly larger proportion of their income. What we posit is that this seems counterintuitive, but often the people who are left to fend for themselves due to impoverishment, due to their circumstances, are often the ones that, due to necessity, need to display fewer outward traits of empathy, because they have to care about themselves and their families first. It is easier, for example, to donate and give to charity and volunteer in areas that will allow you to understand the plight of individuals in the developing world if you are comfortable, if you can afford to go on overseas trips to build up these intuitions of empathy, for example. On the comparative, we think it's far harder for individuals who grew up traditionally in poverty to build up these faculties. That's why Asian cultures, which are poorer, for example, emphasize caring for yourself and your family first above and beyond the needs of other individuals. Third, we think that empathy doesn't necessarily account for other preferences that people have and preferences for their own constitutive attachments, like, for example, their nation. Most empathetic people will still vote to save their families more than the lives of others. So even though we might result in a comparatively better situation because they will care more about the needs of others than their own family, on the whole, it is still better if members of these minority groups get to vote for themselves. So what happens on their side is fewer poor individuals vote, and even those that do, don't necessarily vote for objectively the right policies that can be rationally debated and reasoned out. Then they said, from opening government, that white people will vote for those with the same values, and this results in vested networks of patronage, where individuals endorse particular candidates that are more like them. First of all, this is likely to still happen because white people are still in the majority, even when we count those individuals who are empathetic. Secondly, we think that power networks occur for reasons unrelated to voting, like, for example, political capture and lobbying. So it is not clear that their policy is a solution to this problem. So I think I've proven to you why, therefore, the policy outcomes that their side creates are inequitable and largely harmful to the most vulnerable. But secondly, how do they actually harm politics and political discourse? This is why I engage with the second half of their case, which deals with the whole process of political bargaining and decision-making. We think that their side actually provides a number of fairly perverse incentives for voters and politicians. First of all, what is likely to happen on their side is that politicians are more inclined to use increasingly emotional appeals to justify policies and detract as far as possible from rational grounds of decision-making, such as, for example, quantifying GDP indicators in terms of debating different policy proposals.
Yes. Don't you think that the sort of people you describe who have some empathy for people beyond their immediate family, but who otherwise prefer members of their immediate family or members of their own race to be the average person as opposed to people with high levels of empathy?
I would think so, but unless your policy is that you will only allow people who are empathetic such that they think members of their family are equally valuable as someone living in the world that they have never met before, certainly that would exclude the vast majority of people in most societies, even in the first world, across the world. So it's just not clear to me at all what kind of people that we want to talk about. Obviously, we can assume that most highly empathetic people still have a slight preference for their own family members, even if it is not total and absolute. So what is going to happen, firstly, is that politicians are more inclined to use increasingly emotional appeals to justify policies. This is important. This is an important impact because we think that this creates a race to the bottom where politics becomes about putting graphic images and stories out first. While this is necessary in the process of political discourse, I don't think politics should only focus on this because we need to balance this against justifying these claims based on rational economic grounds, or, for example, reasons like we should not accept this many economic migrants due to brain drain in the developing world. Secondly, and this is important, we think that politicians will only reach out to people they can identify as empathetic. This means that fewer people receive the benefits of having politicians reach out to them and campaign to them, for instance. voices. Fewer people feel included in the process of democratic bargaining and democratic discourse. You might say, well, it's very hard for politicians to distinguish which areas have more empathetic people. First of all, due to reasons of class, it's likely, as I've explained. Second of all, even if this is true, it means a sizable chunk of people just don't feel impacted by the debate in the run-up to elections. So even if politicians can't tangibly distinguish between them, people will just turn off the TV when a political debate comes out because they just don't care since they're not allowed to vote as identified by your empathy test. And we don't think that necessarily is something that individuals can, in some cases, aim to improve or strive towards improving, because to some extent it's influenced by your upbringing or the other innate characteristics. Third, we think that there'll be widespread voter disenfranchisement. You worsen the hatred of individuals who feel like they have been abandoned by Washington and like the pantsuit-wearing elitists who have voted for unfavorable economic policy. Therefore, what will happen is that it's possible that this sentiment might affect the other family members, the people around them who may be apathetic and may be allowed to vote. You increase the total amount of disenfranchisement and the separation you see between the elites who make decisions in power and individuals on the ground who are voting on these decisions. And we think that ultimately this creates a democracy that is perceived to be less inclusive. Even if statistically everyone from every social class is equally affected, individuals will still feel shortchanged by the fact that they are no longer allowed to vote. We're very proud to oppose.
The first thing to note is I think we get very little questioning of the principle behind why this is justified. So I assume that the opposition bench accepts that this is an acceptable policy to do and wishes to quibble primarily on the outcomes. But I think there is one of their concerns that could be construed as a challenge to that, which is the notion that this is a policy that will be perceived to be less inclusive, and that is important. I don't think that is in fact important. As Aditya outlines, firstly, we think it is at least equally likely and probably more likely that if people were presented with a political system which led to outcomes that they preferred on net, then they would prefer that political system, even if in instances they had to second or give away their choice. We know this to be true because, for example, collectively in most democracies, we vote for the legal system and the central bank to be independent of the choices we make in the day-to-day or indeed at election time. So it does seem conceivable that people do not think that their power is being taken away crucially when they see that policies are in fact passed to allow them to have outcomes that they do want. Central question in this debate is what are the implications on politics? No, thank you. But before that, some stuff on why empathy is, or why we think it's principally better for more empathetic people to have more power in the political system, because I anticipate something like this coming up from the opposition bench. We think, firstly, the notion of empathy that we want to describe in this debate is not an empathy based on visceral base feeling, because that is also the assumption that opposition seems to be rests on in some of its argumentation. On the other hand, what we mean by empathy is that you are able to conceive of and care about deeply the moral concerns of other people outside your immediate circle. In status quo, most of us care about the moral concerns of ourselves and people in our immediate circle, and the way in which politicians operate on this is they try to expand that immediate circle via notions like tribe, like race, like religion. We think that is bad. It often leads to divisive consequences. We think, as Aditya points out, that people who are more empathetic under this test will not suffer from that problem, but more importantly, they do not lose the ability to rationally consider what will be good for people outside their immediate circle. The point of empathy is not that you do things based on short-run feelings, but that you are able and willing to consider these people in the first place. We think that, firstly, this makes these people, in fact, more morally legitimate. Opposition might contend later in this debate that to the extent to which people conceive of political participation as some kind of rights-granting mechanism or some kind of, or as something which is bound up with moral worth, then we create, to an extent, a two-speed system of politics. Firstly, I don't think that is the case. I don't think people think about voting rights in that sense. They think more in terms of the outcomes that they get. But even if they do, we are happy to do so because we think that empathy is the seat of morality. We often consider selfishness to be the greatest sin. To think that someone who cares primarily about themselves and has no conception for the feelings or for the consequences of their actions on others to be the least morally worthwhile and desirable people. And we recognize also that these selfish people or people who are unable to be empathetic at all from other individuals may well lead and create disastrous consequences with their actions. No, thank you. People who are more empathetic are far less likely to do this. They are likely to be to take consideration of their actions with respect to how they will affect other people, and they are likely to think about how their vote would affect other people as well. So these people are in fact more morally worthy. We think allowing them to have more power in the political process is a principled and practical good outcome. Before I go on.
Would being more empathetic to unborn children make it more or less likely that you pass on this test?
That seems to be a quibble with like some philosophical question that I don't think I have to resolve in this debate. And it seems like for the purposes of this debate, we should consider these things as resolved because this debate assumes we can measure empathy, not whether all measures of empathy are imperfect. Okay, why do we get better outcomes in politics in this debate? The key thing to note is that I think a lot of opposition's material is just inherently uncomparative on this regard. The first thing they say is that people who are more privileged are more likely to be empathetic, noting Aditya's lack of systemic analysis on this. Firstly, the statistic he cites heavily implies a systemic analysis at its heart, which is this, that people who are poor or vulnerable or disprivileged have a core understanding of other people who may not necessarily be like them, but share that poverty, disprivilege, or oppression, which means that even if your circumstances are different and a poor person first has to do things to serve themselves, they are very aware that other poor people need help, that other poor people are suffering, and that they ought to care about these people. So I think at face value, it is in fact likely that the most vulnerable in society are the most aware and concerned of other people's vulnerability. But secondly, it just ignores the fact, and it's uncomparative to the fact that these poor people are always crowded out in the political system right now, that even if they hold the majority, it is likely that because the political system encourages parties to target everyone and to divide everyone, that they have a relatively smaller voice in the status quo political system where we cannot exclude for empathy. On the contrary, in a world where we can exclude for empathy, there is no longer an incentive for political parties to focus on things that divide or focus on selfish interests. Why? Because those people who are voting for those policies will be less likely to be granted a vote in the first place, to the extent to which you could not completely accurately identify who is eligible for the vote. But even if you could identify to some extent who is eligible for the vote, it makes sense for you to focus on policies that bind people together. Firstly, as Aditya points out, you will no longer craft policies on the basis of inherently divisive lines, because people who are empathetic would face value reject that sort of policy or that sort of identity activation. The harms of that sort of identity activation have already been elucidated. I don't think they're going to be contested further in this debate. Stuff like Modi activating the Hindu identity to create a sort of politics which means that India can never be truly united. There are so many examples in so many places. That no longer happens on our side. But secondly, Aditya notes that the sorts of policies and the sorts of policy compromises that politicians are likely to forward, firstly, break the inherent problem at the heart of selfish aggregation, which is presumably the opposition's countermodel. The notion that people who are disprivileged should band together and fight primarily for their own interests ignores the fact that often these interests end up being opposed, and that because they have gained their political power from citing difference and the unique concerns of themselves, then it is often difficult to resolve which is the net best good. This incentivizes a political system where parties no longer do that and look for policies that benefit all and exclude few. Finally, okay. In sum, we think it's likely that the poor are more empathetic, that empathetic people are more moral and make better decisions, and that on that, this is a political system that means that the worst forms of modern politics, the division, the selfishness, are things that fall away and are replaced by a politics that includes all, or at least leads to outcomes that are better for the net.
Opening government does something that's actually really sneaky. They try to contextualize empathy as something that's more complex than just the feeling of care and concern. No, they tell me it's about the rational consideration of others, about what value you place on the lives of others given a policy. I think that's just wrong and intellectually dishonest, because the rational consideration of others in a utilitarian sense exists on a different philosophical plane as empathy. Let me explain. If I consider the interests of everyone else equally, that is to say, I would regard the interests of a cat or a dog as less valuable than, say, the interests of somebody who is Somalian and starving. But the problem is, that's not how empathy works. Empathy works based on bounded rationalizations of our everyday life. I feel empathetic towards someone else based on some experiences I might have in the past, based on some characteristics that we might have in common. I think the key idea here I'm saying is, it is epistemically impossible to assess whether or not there can ever be an X that is objectively more valuable than a Y. That is to say, it is impossible to ever determine whether or not it is a priori true that the life of a cat is worth more or less than the life of a Somalian. And for Jan to just assert it's trivially obvious that empathy is the rational consideration of others in an effective altruist sense without actually having solved effective altruism for me is deep intellectual dishonesty. I'm going to talk about three things. First, I'm going to talk about policy. Second, I'm going to talk about politics. And finally, I'm going to talk about principle. First, on policy. Arthur told you that the problem with empathy is that it is bounded by pre-existing prejudices and biases. We aren't saying that their policy is the status quo, but we are saying that their policy fails to recognize that very empathetic people still order their preferences, whether they choose one group over another, based on many sociological determinants that really undermines many of the benefits that they claim to have. For example, the imagined community that we call a nation. What does this mean? It means that OG's best case scenario is only marginally better than the status quo. Voters might all empathize more, but this fails to recognize that they still might prioritize the lived experiences of some over others. No thank you. Second problem with their arguments about policy. Even if this is not true, notice that OG concedes that they don't limit voting based on IQ or experience with politics. So it is unclear how your capacity to empathize relates to your ability to choose best for the people you care for. In fact, very often, empathy gets in the way of being able to achieve good outcomes. For example, empathy means being able to relate to the immediate lives of, vulnerable people. For example, if I see a picture of a starving child in Indonesia, I'm intuitively more likely to care for this particular child, for example, wanting to sponsor them to attend school. The problem is that some policies that achieve less good outcomes tend also to pluck better at people's heartstrings. For example, no thank you, sending massive amounts of foreign aid to the developing world might appear to be a good idea, but it often destroys cottage industries and make it harder for local manufacturers to earn a living. And I know what they're saying. This is not empathy best understood, and I'll get to that later in the header I call politics. No thank you. The third problem I have with their argument about policy is that empathy is sometimes a function of class and privilege. Arthur told you that often being less empathetic becomes a coping mechanism that less privileged families employ so they can uplift themselves and deal with the immediacy of everyday problems. And the issue you have here is that when you have lots of relatively privileged, relatively well-off middle-class people who are empathetic, having the complete reins over government control as to how to disburse funds or how to write policy, that's when people are less able to understand the contextual concerns of the vulnerable, are less likely to want to vote for policies that might uplift people. I know this might sound abstract, and that's why I'm going to transit to my second area of analysis on politics. No thank you. And I think the problem with OG's policy is that it gives undue influence to media organizations and the elite to shape the lens through which the small group of empathetic people view politics. What does this mean? On government, the interests of the disprivileged are represented through the secondary mechanism of empathetic people. That is to say, my ability to engage with the external world becomes the mechanism through which disprivileged people's interests are represented. What does this mean? It means that suddenly the most powerful people in the world are now newspaper editors, are now politicians who can shape the way through which you interact with, various concerns in your country. It means that the most powerful people are those who control your TV channels. And why is this a bad thing? It's a bad thing not just because on a principled level it's deeply undemocratic and it basically facilitates the ability for those who shape popular opinion and shape information dissemination to have complete control over the prioritizational aspects of voting. It is bad also because the ability for somebody who is elite or relatively more privileged to understand the contextual concerns of those who are less well off are inherently bound by the words they read on the front page of the New York Times. I'm not less likely to be able to understand what I want to vote for, especially given that you aren't going to limit the vote to people who, for example, have high IQ, etc. But before I go on, Aditi.
Even if there would be an inequality of preference amongst individual empathetic people, this is like an even out amongst large number of empathetic people. At least under our policy, that benefit is distributed to the vulnerable.
But that's not clear, because some people might say the lives of cats are a lot more important than the lives of Rwandans. Others might say that, the lives of starving children are more important, the lives of unborn children are more important. But what is clear is this, and what is very clear is this. What your policy does is that it does give massive power to people who shape the way you interact with the world to be able to control political outcomes. You basically facilitate the degradation of democratic discourse into however politicians frame a particular issue, right? You remove the capacity for facts to ever be able to change the barometer of public opinion. These are the harms that we outlined to you in Arthur, and you've never dealt with them. On to the last area of analysis, on principle. And I think it's wrong for Jan to suggest that we didn't want to run a principle argument. We just thought it was probably slightly less important in this debate. That's why it's in me. But I think that the idea here is this. If people are affected by state policy, they deserve a right to influence state policy. And the reason is very simple. The only reason why we believe that a government should have totalizing influence over your life, be able to dictate that 10% of your income, i.e. 10% of your time, i.e. 10% of you can be paid to its coffers, is because we also allow you the autonomous capacity to elect the people who claim to represent you, right? And in order for us to justify totalitarianism, that's why we need democracy. We need the capacity for everyone who is intimately affected by state policy to be able to then determine the arrangements under which they are governed. And we think this is a principal right in terms of empowerment, and that's why we don't think that disadvantaging people who are less empathetic, disadvantaging those who didn't have a choice but grew up in a circumstance where less empathy was a coping mechanism, should also be allowed to vote. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
So I think there's a lot of clarification that needs to be done as to what empathy exactly is. I think OG does a decent job at clarifying exactly what it is, but I think there's more to be said on the subject. Chin has three main issues with the characterization of empathy. The first of which is that empathy is somehow bounded, and at the point in time in which you cannot epistemically access the experiences of other people whom you might not have ever encountered, you probably will feel less empathy for them. And he goes on, therefore, to assert as well that rich people tend to make up the bulk of people who have high levels of empathy. This is not true on several levels. Firstly, it's profoundly uncomparative, because even in the worst case scenario in which empathy truly is bounded, at the very least, we do a better job of making voters think more about other people outside their immediate area of concern, as opposed to their side, in which case empathy will already be bounded in the status quo. More importantly, it's not mostly rich people, because the ability to be empathetic as a result of the fact that you are comfortable is outweighed by stuff that OG already talks about. You know, the fact that you already suffer experiences with regard to suffering, with regard to poverty, or with regard to sexual assault. All of these things which influence individuals in trying to find meaning in their suffering, and therefore influencing them into trying to help other people as well, making them more empathetic. In fact, for people who are in disadvantaged situations, they often have to rely more on each other than people who are already rich and can therefore preach self-reliance as the key avenue to success. Ergo, these are already two important factors as to why it is not likely that rich people are going to be the majority of empathetic people in this instance. Furthermore, to the extent that empathy is to a significant degree biological, it depends on genetics, your personality, the amount of oxytocin you have in your system. We can agree that there is a baseline group of people who will be empathetic regardless of whether they will be rich or whether they will be poor. So all in all, poor justifications on their side. The second thing they want to talk about with regard to empathy is the idea that it is subjective as to who actually matters more, or even if it weren't subjective, that it is hard to predict exactly which constituency of people will benefit as a result, because different people will have different opinions. First of all, to the extent that empathy, as experienced by the average individual, is correlated highly to the amount of suffering you experience, it is fairly intuitive that people would take into account the suffering of a Somali child more than they would, say, for example, a middle-class kid in America, even if that middle-class kid has troubles of his own. No, thank you. So quite clearly, to the extent that that's how people experience empathy in everyday life, we think there is a quasi-objective way of determining who matters more in this debate. But even in the worst-case scenario in which people often disagree on who matters more, at the very least, we have
comparatively, we do much better in terms of forcing discussion on who exactly matters more, and that's part of the debates that exist in any healthy democracy, as opposed to one in which we see that selfishness often takes precedence over everything else. More importantly, like even to the extent that, if just to revert to the idea of empathy being bounded, even in the worst case scenario in which, let's say, you transport yourself back to the late 1800s where everyone is a flaming racist, the people who are comparatively less racist would eventually fight for like the emancipation of black slaves, for instance. And the same would happen like in like the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Maybe you're still a bit of a racist, but you acknowledge that on the comparative, you would prefer that these people receive the right to vote. That's progress. We iterate ourselves to the point where the moral arc of the universe is long, but it tends towards justice. No, thank you. Last but not least, on the notion of emotional appeal, there are also several reasons like why this is nonsense, right? I acknowledge that in many instances, people who are empathetic or particularly empathetic can also be particularly emotional. But it is also true for people with tribal identities. And that is exactly the sort of emotionality that politicians prey on when they say, yes, your way of living the white, traditional American life is at risk due to like the emergence of immigrants and the changes in your economy. So they don't have a monopoly on dealing with emotional reactions on the part of voters. In fact, we argue that people who are selfish and who cling on to traditional identities would probably be more emotional. Furthermore, there is a mechanism for how we ensure that people who are empathetic are also rational, because there are often conflicting empathetic responses to various constituencies of people that we care about, even if empathy is bounded. Ergo, that forces people to reconsider which group of people they will make the hard trade-off for in the long run. At the very least, this also ensures that we don't preclude alternative solutions to try to bypass the trade-off. That people think more about how we can best maximize the benefits to various types of constituencies, and that doesn't preclude people in the media, for example, from making alternative arguments for not providing free shoes to people in developing communities, because you are still centering your arguments on the same group of people, poor people in developing countries, except that you make different arguments as to how to help them. That is not precluded in our world. I'm going to move on to extension, where apart from the fact that we've already given you a lot of extension material with regard to how empathy actually works in real life, I want to illustrate the concrete contexts and mechanisms by which opening government's material and benefits are realized. The first of which is identity. And identity, and I'll take you in a bit, is particularly important in nascent democracies where A, it is not guaranteed that you have constitutional rights that protect minorities because they're fledgling democracies, and B, where the defining feature of these democracies is the idea that they are fragmented ethnically or religiously, and therefore it becomes far more of a zero-sum game than Western liberal democracies. Before I move on, go.
So PM says people can take active steps to improve their empathy, like volunteering. Doesn't this concede that A, it is not innate, and B, that rich people have more time to do it?
I mean, so it may not be innate, but I think opportunities for developing empathy are far outweighed by the lived experiences that you've already experienced in the formative years of your life. So, and even if rich people are marginally more empathetic as a result of that particular mechanism, I don't see why it's a big issue. Sure, the more empathetic people there are in the world, the better. So back to identity. The first key constituency is nation democracies, because our solution is the only solution that bypasses the zero-sum problem inherent in most fledgling democracies. That's how most fledgling democracies fail. Under our policy, we get the constitutional rights for minorities because only people who are particularly empathetic can vote for these things. The second constituency of people are the unborn. In response to their POI, it is true, perhaps we ought to be more empathetic to people who don't exist yet and who exist in the future, especially at the point in time where we need to talk about economic restructuring policies, education policies, like funding more money for kids, or climate change policies for people who are unborn and the environment that we need to take care of for their sake. We think that our side is the only side that ensures that we have better policies that help the future of our generation. The last group of people I want to talk about are people outside your countries, right? People who don't vote in your own system. Unlike democracies in the status quo, the arena of international relations is a complete anarchy. They don't have a solution in the status quo to ensure that the interests of these people are adequately represented when people in the United States make policy on their behalf. That is why only our side has the mechanism by which we can achieve that. Vote, closing gov.
Thank the member of government, and we're very happy to call the member of opposition.
your ability to see other people as humans. So that doesn't mean that tribalism is gone. It just means that I'm able to expand what I think my tribe should constitute of, correct? We also think that it is absolutely impossible to demand that everybody, in every, like for you to be able to vote, essentially means that you can, like,
ensure that like you have no upper limit to how large this tribe can go. Because that was where the closing government's extension seemed to be going, when they went about developing nations and how even nationalism perhaps is something that is deeply harmful and hurtful. So you essentially, the only people who will be able to vote will be people who are so empathetic that they can have anybody and everybody as part of that tribe. And we think that that's just a bizarre test that we think that most people will fail. Because I'll go into reasons for that like later on, why is this important? But I'm going to be talking about three things within this debate, rebuttals and substantives amalgamated. The first on how the principle of the one man, one vote, and how like we'll just be the first one to clarify on why this is just principally justified. Secondly, that on how empathetic people are just less intelligent and less rational. I'm going to go out there and bite that bullet, and why that kind of bad behavior is exactly what's affirmed when you create policies like this to like basically affirm, lock in bad behavior in society. But why is one man, one vote essentially principally justified, right? Let's just recognize a few things that comes out on their side that is, we think that just inherently discriminatory. As Adil pointed out in his member, it's sometimes biologically true that some people are just unable to be less empathetic to others, right? Like people with autism, for example, are people that are constantly going to be locking out and like blocking them forever from being able to represent the right essentially to protect themselves. And like this is where my extension comes in, because we think that democracy being one man, one vote isn't just about you affirming your beliefs. We think that democracy is also about self-defense, because every time somebody else makes a trade-off on what policies they determine or what politics they determine is important to them, you might be the one caught in the crossfire and determined as less important in their eyes. Maybe because they just did some cross-benefit calculation and thought that that would just be better for them. As a result, we think that every single person in society, regardless of their political stance, should have that ability to be able to defend themselves from other people who are essentially voting down their interests, deprioritizing their interests one notch down in parliament with every vote. We recognize that this is not always a good system, but that's why we have other things such as your court, such as like lobby groups and stuff like that to be able to lock out the worst of these policies. Here's the counterfactual. We just think that we agree that poor people are probably going to be the least empathetic within society. Look at every single migrant group, no thanks, sit down, which you look at within like, I don't know, like the US or Australia or whatever, right? Especially migrant East Asians and South Asian groups tend to be the ones who scream the loudest when their kids talk about marrying some white kid or something like that, right? They're the ones who are, like the people who are poor and who have had their entire life spat on usually believe that their tribe is the only one that can protect themselves, and are probably the ones who are going to be failing this empathetic test most. Why is this then important? Because then, as Chinwe sort of alluded to within his speech, but I am now extending, others choose their decisions for you. And here I'm going to talk about a new material on why this is especially like harmful. Sit down. This is because even if you are empathetic and you feel best towards other people, it does not necessarily mean you make the best policy decisions or you understand what is best. This is something that's been thrown around. I'm going to show you concretely why. For instance, when, I don't know, the lost generation of Australia was essentially white people thinking that native Australians were essentially unfit parents. They felt for the children, right? Because we always feel bad for the children. And they chose then to separate the children from their parents because they genuinely thought and felt that the best course of action for these children was to be away from their unfit, drunkard parents. We think that this is the kinds of policies the government is essentially going to consistently empower.
Yes.
By the law of averages, an equal number of rational and irrational people get selected as they screen for empathy. Can you tell us why empathy is actually more...
I'm going to move on to this right now, why the law of averages does not work. Okay, but before that, really quickly, with problems with things like trade-off politics and essentially having people always go with your gut feeling and basically choosing for you. It's like essentially saying that the rational liberal who said, I prefer to vote Hillary as opposed to Trump because she might not be my first choice, but she's still a way better person than Trump, rather than the bleeding heart, empathetic liberal who just be like, I want to shake up the world, right? These are basically, again, the people that their side is empowering. But here's why empathetic people are just less intelligent and rational. Psychologically speaking, we just think that they are. You are just tend to be a lot more certain because you don't go around looking for confirmation from other sources. You just feel that emotion and then you are certain that this is the truth. This is why it is always incredibly much more difficult to be able to talk to someone who is either more empathetic or emotional or who feels a lot more strongly about the issues that they are espousing because their feelings have confirmed it for them. And because the rest of us are not able to access those feelings, it is more difficult for us to be able to tell them that maybe, hey, it's not the best idea to separate like immigrant children from their parents and lock them up inside of cages, even if you think that their parents are incredibly immoral. Sit down. We also then think that, we just think that emotional appeal is something that's particularly bad and is something that their side is essentially affirming and locking down within these kinds of societies. Because right now with their policy, your society essentially is saying that you know what, those gut feelings that you're feeling for that child is probably more important than other people's more considered research where maybe that child will grow and suffer within their parents as opposed to being forced to go into a foster care system. But that's a trade-off, that is not a decision that we think that somebody else coming in from the outside is able to make, and we think the parents should be able to make the decisions themselves, but you're likely to take that away from the parents. Here's where, again, the member of government had this really bizarre piece of analysis about how when you say that, people will be rational because you're trading off about thinking about two different outcomes. Do I care about the child or do I care about the cat, right? We just don't think that's how their test is necessarily going to work because, as I said, they're only going to test about whether or not you can extend that tribe. It doesn't necessarily test for how far you can extend that tribe. And more than that, we think that liberals tend to usually be the worst people who make these kinds of decisions, right? Like the same people who went Bernie or bust. The same kinds of people who essentially went if we can't get it my way, basically, everything else goes because we much rather let the world burn if we can't get the first choice that we have. Those, again, are the empaths that they are going to be empowering and the society that they are essentially saying is more important than any other kinds of rational, calculated consideration or policy or politics. The problem with the side of your opposition is that they are wholly uncomparative and merely point out certain instances in which empathy might be a problem. Let's first answer the question of what necessarily empathy is, which is something that's been hotly contested in this debate. So, okay, I can accept from opposition that perhaps you won't see every single individual as being equal to you, that there are limits to the bounded rationality that exists. The problem is comparatives, which is to say that empathetic individuals are able to expand that definition of their circle wider than what people currently are being able to expand it. This is important because if you look at OG's case, they literally only the entirety of their case is premised upon the one assumption that the only people that can be empathetic are the rich because that's the only way which they can create inequality on their side of the house. So firstly, let's just deal with why is it that we don't think the rich are likely to be more empathetic. Firstly, we think we already told you. Oftentimes, the ways in which individuals develop empathy is through a visceral understanding of oppression and suffering. So oftentimes, the reason why individuals are not empathetic is because they don't know what it's really like to suffer, and the most common narrative that you hear is that it can't be that bad, or they could have worked harder to get out of the situations that they were in because they've never faced a situation in which they were limited by the kind of circumstances that they were in and faced those same oppressions themselves. That is why we think, structurally speaking, poor people are far more likely to understand their visceral suffering. The idea of volunteering, for instance, being able to make you more empathetic is because you have an interaction and you're able to viscerally see the suffering that poorer individuals go through. That is why we think that people who are already in those positions are far more likely to be empathetic rather than rich people who have to try harder. But even if you don't buy any of these claims to be true, I would just like to ask the opening opposition, right? Their harms were, this world will have the media that is more in power of how people vote. This world will have rich people who are more able to dominate the discussion and voting. In what world do you live in that these are not things that are already true? In the comparative on our side of the house, at the very least, we have individuals who are more likely to be able to consider individuals outside of their most immediate self-interest. So look at how voting works on our side of the house, right? Firstly, we think that we're able to take out perhaps the most racist or the most self-interested groups of individuals and the kind of policies they are likely to propagate. But secondly, we think
think that the voices of the ideal empath are therefore stronger. So even if we concede to the fact that not everyone is the ideal empath to the extent to which they're able to deal or consider everyone as being equal, we think that given that they are the minority, like how opposition characterizes, at least on our side of the house, they take up a larger proportion of the voting base, and they are more likely to have their voices heard under this particular circumstance. Right, let's deal with the second point of empathy that closing opposition wants to talk about, because I think this idea is literally ludicrous, right? Their argument literally starts from a sexist idea of how empathetic individuals are therefore more likely to be emotional and incapable of considering rationality. I think that's just how people characterize women, and that's the reason why they don't want to let women make decisions. I don't understand why there cannot be a dislocation of your emotions and ability to understand the plight of a different individual and still rationally consider whether or not these people are going to benefit at the end of the day via the policies that you propose. There were no structural reasons as to why exactly this should be a fact that we accept in this particular debate. But also, I would just ask them, if they believe that empathetic individuals are incapable of voting rationally, would you therefore, under this technology, deny them the ability to vote? Because I think that's the only thing you can do to be principally consistent of your side of the house. Right, let's quickly deal with principal problems before we talk about the practical. The other side of the house says that the principle of voting is the idea of self-protection, that if things affect you, you ought to have a say with regards to those things. Here's the problem. Currently, our principle of protection has failed because the ability of certain majoritarian groups to have their self-interest entrenched and allow for those self-interests to continue to fester via things like gerrymandering, via things like creating voting policies that block out the most vulnerable individuals, no thank you Chin, from being able to vote, for instance, are things that we think have already cemented their ability and therefore denied many communities the right to self-protection on their side of the house. So we think that on our side, at least people who look through the lens of empathy are far more likely to take out these kinds of policies. Right, outcomes. Why is it that their side is objectively worse? What is the likelihood, or what does the world look like today? In a world in which individuals are more likely to work on self-interest, we think that opening government has already told you why politics tends to run more on the idea of self-interest and certain groups. We are going to expand on that and illustrate and show you, like what we did in Adil, why this is problematic. So I think that these policies look a lot like countries like Malaysia, where, for example, the continual pandering towards particular ethnic identities and the self-interest of individuals has resulted in objectively worse off outcomes for individuals. Like, for example, the institution of Bahasa Melayu in order to pander to the Malay classes that exist in those countries, no thank you, rather than allowing for English via the narrative of Western imposition, even though this leads to objectively worse economic outcomes for the nation as a whole. But what is the comparative on their side of the house? We think, firstly, we are happy to trade off individuals who are currently feeling excluded on their side as a result of not being able to vote in self-interest for individuals who are currently being left out and excluded on our side of the house because they are too poor to be able to make those votes and make those decisions. But secondly, I think it's just simply unclear on their side why long-run and short-run policies are something that they win. So here are a couple of analyses with regards to that. Firstly, I think on our side of the house, it's not about not being able to vote for long-run imperatives, but rather the ability to soften the blow in the meantime of these long-run comparatives. So for example, in the decision to shut down sunset industries, it's entirely possible for empath to be able to say that like this creates suffering for people in the future, which Adi already covered, and therefore that's something that we can be empathetic towards. The difference being that given that welfare is something, in just 1 second, that's hotly contested right now, we think on our side of the house, we're more likely to be able to make perhaps the transition slower, dealing with some short-run like cost or economy, but ultimately still be able to get the same long-run trade-offs while not necessarily disenfranchising people in the meantime. Before that, yes.
So on both sides, the media is biased. On both sides, the rich control information dissemination. But uniquely on our side, the vulnerable represent themselves in the ballot box and don't have to trust empaths.
Yeah, but I just told you, the vulnerable can't currently like represent themselves in the ballot box because the ability of self-interested people who are currently entrenched in power, and oftentimes they are more successful because they were so self-interested, are able to stop them from being able to do so. At least empaths is a greater incentive to care about these people rather than on their side of the house. But second, I think it's uncertain on their side why these long-run decisions can even be made in the first place. So the dismantling of lobby groups, for example, literally gets harder on their side because of the inability to look beyond your current self-interest and say this is a policy that uniquely benefits me and not care about anyone else in your community or in your nation as long as you continue to be able to draw a higher salary, even if that means economically worse off outcomes for everyone involved. So I don't think that they can claim the idea that people can make hard decisions because self-interested individuals are not able to make those hard decisions on their side of the house either. And even if it was true there was a structural impossibility, then that afflicts both sides of the house. But we also told you that this creates many other worse off outcomes to the point at which you focus on identity beyond that of like beyond that of like things that actually care about other individuals. Because to the extent to which we think that the focus on identity politics, for example, and the immediate self-interest that is played on by these media biases makes it more difficult, for example, to remove things like Najib, who was in power by continually pandering to like Malaysian populist policies, for example, or inability to like create policies that don't specifically deal with populist rhetoric like ethnicities and prioritizing their interests over others and the creation of resentment in those nations. We think we are able to remove the worst excesses of that. Comparatively, we are much better off. We're happy to oppose.
Let's start with the outcomes of this debate, which were shockingly simple. Everyone agrees with Jan that the definition of empathy is a heightened feeling for the moral wrongs that more people suffer. But the misunderstanding of the entire government bench that Natalie points out at closing government is that it does not define what their understandings of moral wrongs are. Some empathetic people will feel more for unborn children than for pregnant women, as those children are voiceless. Some will feel more for the sufferer of sexual assault, whereas some will feel more for the person accused of sexual assault because that's the way their values line up. Some will genuinely feel more sorry for children that have to be raised in an indigenous household than the parents who have their children ripped away from them. And I think the government bench is right to point out that opening opposition only uses this vague type of observation mitigatively, because they just say, well, in that case, empathetic people are not always as bad as good as the government bench claims it is. But at closing opposition, we proved to you that that was more likely to be comparatively harmful. And that reason was very simple, because it gives you certainty about the values that you have right now. It locks them in because you feel them so intensely, you get so upset when they are challenged because your feeling of empathy is so heightened when you see the moral wrongs that you were raised to believe were moral wrongs, that you cannot have the debate that the closing government members so optimistically believed you could have, because people weren't going to debate about values that they now experience so viscerally and so deeply. So that is why, comparatively, their world is far worse. Because the privileged people who, in our side of the world, could be convinced that they should care about people who their values say they shouldn't care about, because you can say, well, you know, you might care about this, but here is something else that you can also care about as the result of your rational self-interest or as a result of, you know, rational moral discussion. Now, those values that are built to privilege the privileged cannot be taken away from them. They're locked into their hearts forever because the empaths are the ones who are voting. That is the comparative harm that we provide to you at closing opposition, which clearly wins us this debate. But the second thing that we told you is what resolved the clash about whether or not empathetic people could be as rational as people who are not so empathetic. And we told you that they couldn't be. They were less likely at making decisions, and that was, again, for that same observation that we told you at closing opposition, which is that because you feel it so intensely, it is more likely that you're going to be certain that it's true, because And there's a very easy way for you to also believe that that is true. For instance, it is much more difficult to convince someone, as Natalie told you, of your position if they are very certain about their position or if they are very emotional about their position, which shows to you that people are less likely to rationally consider their beliefs. The responses that we got from the closing government whip were extremely silly. The first was, well, that's just sexist rhetoric. No, it's not. That's like saying that back in the day when women were denied education, it would be sexist rhetoric to say that women were less informed voters. No, they just were less informed voters because of the societal oppression they face. Just like they are less informed voters now because of the societal oppression that they face. That makes them internalize a misogyny that makes them less capable of making those types of decisions in some circumstances. So, The other kind of response was just to say that there was no structural analysis, which is false. In fact, we are the only team that has provided you that structural analysis, which is to say that when your emotions are stronger about a certain value, that is when you're less likely to challenge them, because challenging them upsets you more. The good material, I think, and probably the best material that I have heard from this government bench, I think was in opening government, when they said, oh no, it was actually in closing government, when they said that what would actually happen is empathetic people would likely be conflicted and therefore have to rationally weigh up those things, and therefore they would make quite good decisions. But our argument responds to that too, because in the course of that weigh-up, that would be an extremely upsetting type of weigh-up for any empathetic person to do, which means that the more likely thing that they would do would just be to err on the side that their values tell them, to lock their hearts to the other person who they might feel empathetic to, and therefore that rational trade-off would actually look more like them erring on the side of what their emotions tell them the most. I'll take closing.
So, even in the best case scenario where you prove that empathetic people are less capable of making rational decisions, what is the incentive on your side to pass? Clearly you need both capability and incentives to make good decisions.
No, none of that makes sense. I'm just saying that it'd be better if you have more people voting rather than empathetic people, because that would mean there are more rational people voting. And that also doesn't respond to the first part of my argument, which is that they are also more likely to be prejudiced than your guys are. Cool. So that is why at this point in my speech, I've won the debate twice, because I've shown you first that they'll be more likely to be prejudiced, and secondly, even if they won't be, the policies that they would be likely to implement would be actively harmful because of the irrationality that only closing opposition would prove they have. No, thank you. So, one quick thing I want to point out is that another problem with the whole Gov bench is that they never explained why the counterfactual is impossible, because it's very easy to just explain to someone that something is morally important in a rational sense, or why something is in someone's selfish interest, like saying more immigration leads to economic growth, and that is actually, as I said, much easier when their values aren't as hard encoded into them. So, that's why I win that issue. Secondly, on the principle, opening government says that if you thought that there'd be a good, undemocratic government, then you'd choose that over a worse democracy. But you wouldn't for the reason we tell you, which is that there's no such thing as a good government. There is the aggregation of preferences which conflict against each other. And there is the right that we point to you at closing opposition that closing government never responds to, which is that it is your right to self-defend against being traded off by the government, against being traded off by other people for the values that they hold dear. And that principle extends even towards causing harm, because even if it would be more harmful for you to just cop it and take a light punch, it's still in your right to defend yourself, because that's how self-defense works. This is principally just, it leads to worse, unjust, it leads to worse policies. We clearly win this debate.
Thank you very much, everybody. We don't have much time, so please shake your hands as in this room. We'll call you back shortly.